You don't belong here." His voice was cold, commanding. But Emily wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She'd spent her entire life bowing to others, but not tonight. Tonight, she was ready for something more. Tonight, the Duke of Montgomery would see her, not as the poor orphan, but as a woman with a fire he couldn't ignore. The storm outside raged, snow falling in thick sheets as the world grew quieter, but within Grey Court Hall, everything was about to change. Emily Carson, standing on the threshold of the grand estate, was about to step into a world of secrets, power, and a love that could tear it all apart. As she crossed the threshold, her heart raced. The Duke's piercing gray eyes studied her intently, his gaze filled with curiosity and something else. Something dangerous. She wasn't sure what it was, but she wasn't about to turn back. She had nothing to lose. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly, keeping her head high, but she couldn't hide the unease in her voice. She had come here for a reason, though she wasn't sure what that reason was, or if she was even ready for what awaited her. The Duke stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "It's not an intrusion, Miss Carson," he said, his voice low, like a quiet storm. "But you have to understand, this is no place for someone like you." His words were sharp, but there was a flicker of something behind them, a tension that made her pulse quicken. She could feel his power, his authority. She could feel the weight of his every step as he moved closer to her. She should be afraid. She should run. But she didn't. "I'm not afraid," she said, lifting her chin, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "I'm not the same girl I was when I walked in." The Duke's lips twitched, almost as if he was amused, but his eyes never left hers. "We'll see," he murmured, his gaze now softer, almost reluctant. Emily stood her ground. This wasn't the same girl who had once cowered in the shadows. She had nothing left to lose. And the Duke? He had everything to gain from breaking the rules. As they stood there in silence, the storm outside roared louder, but inside Grey Court, time seemed to stand still. There was no going back. Tonight, everything changed. Emily had expected the estate to be grand, but nothing could have prepared her for the cold elegance of Grey Court Hall. The tall, towering walls seemed to close in on her as she followed the Duke through the vast, dimly lit hallways. The storm outside still raged, but inside, the mansion felt like a tomb, silent and imposing. The Duke's footsteps echoed on the marble floors, the sound sharp against the soft whisper of her own shoes. They came to a stop in front of a massive wooden door. The Duke turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "This is where you'll be staying," he said, his voice firm. She nodded silently, unsure of what to say. How could she explain that she didn't belong here? That everything in this place felt foreign, and yet, she couldn't tear herself away? "You'll be safe here," he continued, his eyes narrowing as if assessing her every move. Emily swallowed hard. "Thank you," she managed to say, though the words felt hollow in her throat. The Duke studied her for a moment longer, his gaze heavy. "You're not like the others, are you?" he asked quietly, as if more to himself than to her. Emily didn't know how to answer. She wasn't sure what the others meant. Wealthy, well-dressed women who had no place in her world? Women who wouldn't dare to question a Duke's orders? She wasn't sure, but she knew she wasn't like them. She wasn't like anyone here. "No, I'm not," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke's lips curled slightly at the corners, but there was no humor in it. "We'll see," he murmured. Then he turned and opened the door, gesturing for her to enter. Emily hesitated for just a second, then stepped inside. The room was magnificent, large windows with thick velvet curtains, a massive four-poster bed draped with heavy linens, and a fireplace that crackled in the corner, casting a soft glow on the antique furniture. Despite the beauty, she felt out of place. This was a life she'd never imagined for herself, yet here she was. The Duke shut the door behind her and took a step back, allowing her to take in her surroundings. "You'll be well taken care of," he said. "There's no need for you to worry." She wanted to say something. Anything. To break the silence, but her words failed her. She didn't know what she expected from him. Certainly not kindness. Certainly not this strange, quiet understanding that seemed to linger between them. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked before she could stop herself. The Duke turned back toward her, his eyes sharp. "Because I had to," he said simply. "You'll understand soon enough." Emily stared at him, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. He was hiding something. She could sense it. But what? Why did he care about a poor orphan like her? She'd never know the answers, but something told her that staying here would change everything, whether she was ready or not. Emily stood at the edge of the room, watching the Duke as he turned away, his broad back stiffening under the weight of something unspoken. The air felt thick between them, like something was about to break, but neither of them moved. She had asked the question that had been on her mind since she arrived, but his response only raised more questions. "Because I had to," he said, as though that was enough. As though she should understand without explanation. But she didn't. She couldn't. She was just an orphan, a nobody in this world of grandeur. And yet, here she was, standing in the Duke's private chamber, surrounded by wealth and secrets. The crackling fire seemed to mock her confusion, its warmth not enough to thaw the chill settling in her bones. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the Duke's back. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. He didn't answer at first. He simply turned and looked at her, his eyes intense, unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied, his voice low. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and curiosity. She wasn't sure she wanted to know what he meant. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she was already tangled in something much bigger than herself. Something dangerous. He moved toward the window, his long fingers brushing the curtain aside as he stared out into the storm. Emily didn't know what to do with herself. She was in his world now, his house, his rules. She had no place here, and yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. The Duke turned back to her, his gaze softening for just a moment. "Now," he said, "you stay here, until I figure out what to do with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily's stomach clenched. She wasn't sure if she should be relieved or terrified. "And what if I don't want to stay?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The Duke's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Then you leave," he said simply. "But remember, the world out there is much more dangerous than you think." Emily swallowed hard. He wasn't just talking about the storm. He was talking about something much bigger, something she wasn't prepared for. She could feel it, deep in her bones. Something dark and powerful was at play here, and it involved her. She had no choice but to stay, to learn whatever secret the Duke was hiding. But as she stood there, facing him, Emily realized that staying might be the most dangerous thing of all. Emily awoke to the sound of the storm still howling outside, the wind rattling the window panes. She lay still for a moment, her thoughts clouded by the events of the night before. The Duke's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "You stay here until I figure out what to do with you." Asterisk, his voice was still fresh in her ears, though the warmth of the fire had long since faded from the room. She could feel the weight of his presence even now, despite the distance between them. It was strange, how a man could be so distant and yet so close all at once. She got out of bed, the cool air of the room sending a shiver down her spine as she wrapped herself in the thick robe left for her. The mansion felt even colder now, almost as though it were holding its breath. Emily stepped to the window, glancing out at the endless expanse of snow, wondering what awaited her in this strange place. Was she truly safe here, or had she just walked into something darker than she could have ever imagined? The Duke had been kind, in his own way, but there was always something lurking behind his eyes, something unreadable, distant. She couldn't quite figure him out. One moment, he seemed like a man of strength and control, and the next he was a stranger to her, lost in his own thoughts. She wasn't sure what to expect from him today. Would he be the same Duke who offered her protection, or would he retreat into the cold man she had first met? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it to find a maid standing in the hallway, holding a tray of food. "Breakfast, Miss Carson," the maid said, her voice soft. "The Duke requested that you join him in the dining room." Emily nodded, a feeling of unease settling over her. The Duke wanted her to join him? It was hard to imagine what that would mean. She had barely spoken to him, but now she was being invited to share a meal? Was this part of some plan she didn't understand? "Thank you," Emily replied quietly, taking the tray. The maid offered her a brief smile, before disappearing down the hallway. Emily stood there for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was about to change, something she wasn't ready for. She looked down at the tray in her hands, her stomach tightening. As she made her way to the dining room, her heart beat a little faster. This was the first time she'd been summoned to the Duke's presence, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Would it be another cold, indifferent conversation, or would this time be different? The dining room was just as grand as the rest of the mansion, with high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and an enormous table set with silver and crystal. The Duke was already seated at the far end, his gaze lifting as she entered. "Miss Carson," he greeted her, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, as though he was waiting for her to say something. Emily hesitated, feeling the weight of his eyes on her. She had no words at first. The room felt too big, the silence too heavy. "You've been quiet this morning," he observed, his eyes narrowing. "What's on your mind?" She looked at him, trying to find the courage to speak. "I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in all of this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, to her surprise, he leaned back in his chair and smiled, just slightly. "I think you'll find your place here, Miss Carson. But it's not going to be easy." Emily's heart raced. He hadn't said much, but there was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at her, that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something much larger than herself. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The Duke's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning, but Emily couldn't bring herself to respond. Instead, she stared at the polished wood of the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. The room felt larger now, the distance between them growing with each passing second. She didn't know why she was here, or what he expected from her. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about survival. There was something more at play, something she was too afraid to understand. The Duke's gaze never left her, his eyes searching, almost studying. "Tell me, Miss Carson," he began again, his voice steady but carrying an underlying tension. "What do you see when you look at this place?" Emily blinked, surprised by the question. What did she see? She had no idea how to answer. She had only just arrived, still adjusting to the grand, cold expanse of Grey Court. "I see a place of power," she said, the words coming more easily than she expected. "A place where people come to play their roles, whether they like it or not." The Duke's lips twitched into a half-smile, but there was no humor in it. "Power," he repeated, nodding. "Yes, that's one way to look at it. But it's not just power that makes this place what it is. It's the secrets, the things hidden behind these walls. People don't just play their roles here, they become them." Emily's heart skipped a beat. There was something chilling in his words, something she couldn't quite place. She wanted to ask him more, wanted to understand what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she settled for another question, one that had been haunting her since she walked through the door. "And what role do you play, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I play the role I was born to play," he said, his tone darkening. "But that doesn't mean I like it." His confession caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to admit to such vulnerability. It was strange, seeing him like this, human, almost. But Emily knew better than to trust that softness. There was always something hidden, something dangerous. The silence stretched between them as they sat there, neither of them speaking, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The Duke's eyes softened for a brief moment, and then he rose from his chair, his movements fluid, graceful. "Now you stay? You learn," he said, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. "And you watch. There are many things you don't understand, Miss Carson. Things that could change your life forever. But for now, all you need to do is wait." His words hung in the air, thick with promise and threat all at once. Emily didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain, there was no turning back. She had already crossed a line, and she had no idea where it would lead. All she could do was follow him, wherever this strange, dangerous path would take her. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even as she walked through the vast corridors of Grey Court. The mansion felt alive with its silence, the only sounds her own footsteps echoing through the hall. The walls, adorned with ancient portraits and tapestries, seemed to whisper of long-forgotten secrets. She had barely settled in, yet every inch of this place felt foreign, a world apart from everything she knew. It was overwhelming, the grandeur and coldness of it all. As she turned a corner, she found herself in front of an imposing door. It wasn't like the others she had passed by. This one felt different, more significant. Her heart raced as she reached for the handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, revealing a library unlike anything she had ever seen. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with books that seemed to stretch on forever. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air, making her feel both at peace and uneasy. In the center of the room, sitting by the fireplace, was the Duke. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carson," he greeted her, his voice low and steady. "I trust you're adjusting well to your surroundings?" Emily nodded, though the words stuck in her throat. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was telling the truth. There was so much she didn't understand, so much that seemed out of place. The Duke motioned for her to sit across from him. "Please, join me," he said, his tone inviting but still distant. Emily hesitated for a moment, then slowly crossed the room and sat down. The Duke studied her with those intense gray eyes, as if he was waiting for something, though she couldn't tell what. "You're wondering why you're here, aren't you?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had wondered it every day since she had arrived, but hearing him say it out loud made the question feel more real. I don't know, Your Grace," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke's gaze softened, just for a moment. "You're not the only one with questions, Miss Carson," he said, his voice suddenly heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "But some answers can't be given all at once." Emily swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She had come here seeking something. Answers, perhaps, or maybe just a way out of her past. But now, with the Duke sitting across from her, the weight of his words pressed down on her. She realized that this place, this man, held more power over her than she could have ever imagined. "What do you expect of me, Your Grace?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The Duke leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I expect nothing but your presence, Miss Carson," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you will find that staying here will change you. And perhaps you will change me as well." Emily didn't know what to make of his words. There was so much left unsaid, so much hidden behind those gray eyes. But as she sat there, in the quiet of the library, she knew one thing for sure. Her life had just become intertwined with his in ways she couldn't yet understand. And whether she was ready for it or not, there was no turning back. Emily sat in the dim light of the library, the weight of the Duke's words still hanging in the air like a thick fog. "You will change me as well," he had said, and it echoed in her mind, a mystery that gnawed at her thoughts. How could someone like him be changed by someone like her? She wasn't even sure what kind of person she was anymore. Her life had always been about surviving, moving from one place to the next, always in the background. But here, in Gray Court, everything felt different, intense, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. As the days passed, Emily found herself in a strange rhythm. The Duke had kept his distance, yet his presence was always felt. He would occasionally summon her for meals, where they would exchange only the most formal of words. His eyes, though, never seemed to leave her, studying her in a way that made her heart race. Every time their gazes met, it was as if he were seeing right through her, into something deep and hidden. It was unnerving. She wasn't sure what to make of it. The Duke was a mystery wrapped in power and coldness. But it wasn't just his silence that confused her. It was the way he would disappear into the mansion for hours, leaving her alone in the grand, empty halls. What did he do in those quiet moments? What did he think about when she wasn't there? She had to know. One evening, she found herself standing at the foot of the stairs, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't shake. The mansion was quiet, too quiet. The usual servants had long gone to their rooms, and she was alone in the vast silence. She couldn't explain why, but a part of her felt drawn to the deeper parts of the estate, the areas she hadn't yet explored. There was a curiosity inside her now, a feeling that if she wandered far enough, she would find the answers she sought. Her footsteps echoed as she crept down the hall, the flickering light of the candles casting long shadows against the walls. She reached a door at the far end of the corridor, one she hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, and a sliver of light peeked through. Emily paused, her breath shallow. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as she stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of the fireplace. And there, sitting by the fire, was the Duke. His eyes met hers instantly, sharp and knowing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with tension. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice low but clear. "You're curious, Miss Carson," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But some things are not meant to be uncovered." Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she whispered, stepping closer. The Duke's expression softened, though only slightly. "You are a part of something now, something much larger than you realize." He stood up slowly, his tall frame looming in the dim light. "But you must understand, Miss Carson, the more you uncover, the less you can return to the life you once knew." Emily swallowed hard. She didn't know what he was implying, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm not afraid," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. The Duke's lips twitched in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I know," he said quietly. "That is what makes you dangerous." For the first time, Emily felt a chill of understanding run through her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever was to come, but one thing was clear. Her life in Grey Court had just become far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Emily's mind raced as she stood before the Duke, his last words lingering in the air like an echo. "You are a part of something now, something much larger than you realize." She had always known that her life would never be the same after stepping into Grey Court, but now, the weight of his statement hit her like a physical blow. What did he mean by that? She felt a chill of both excitement and fear, knowing that she had only just begun to scratch the surface of the mystery surrounding this place. The Duke's presence was like a shadow that followed her, not oppressive, but impossible to ignore. Every room she entered seemed to carry a piece of him, his absence just as loud as his presence. She had never been someone who feared the unknown, but now, with every glance she shared with him, she could feel the pull of something deeper, something dangerous. It wasn't just the mansion itself. It wasn't just the Duke. It was the feeling that, somehow, her very existence was intertwined with this place, that Grey Court had a grip on her that she couldn't break, no matter how hard she tried. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the library creaked open. The Duke stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the soft light spilling from the hall. "Miss Carson," he said, his voice low and calm, though she could hear the weight behind the words. "We need to talk." Emily hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't sure what kind of conversation he meant, but she couldn't refuse him, not anymore. She nodded and followed him into the room. The fire had dimmed since the last time she was here, casting long shadows across the shelves of books that lined the walls. The Duke motioned for her to sit, and she did, her heart beating in her chest as she watched him move toward the fireplace. He turned to face her, his eyes piercing. "You have questions," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. Emily could feel the tension building between them, thick and suffocating. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm not sure where to start." The Duke's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "Start with what you're most afraid of," he said quietly. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had known fear in her life, but this was different. The fear she felt now wasn't of the unknown, it was of him, of what he might do to her. "I'm afraid of," she paused, trying to find the right words, "of being trapped." The Duke's gaze softened just a fraction, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something other than the cold indifference she had grown accustomed to. "You are trapped, Miss Carson," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "But not by me. You're trapped by your own fear. Your fear of letting go." Emily's chest tightened. She had been holding on to something for so long, her past, her survival instincts, her identity. But now, in the Duke's presence, it felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. She had nothing left to hold on to. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The Duke's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. "I want you to understand that this place, these walls, the people here, they will change you. They will break you if you let them." His words were heavy, deliberate, as if he was trying to prepare her for something she wasn't ready to face. Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "And if I don't let them?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he stepped closer. "Then you will have to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But remember, Miss Carson, the world outside is much more dangerous than you think." She didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Emily had no idea what her future held, but one thing was certain. She was already too deep into this, and there was no turning back now. The Duke's words echoed in Emily's mind long after he had spoken them. The world outside is much more dangerous than you think. It wasn't just the mansion that made her feel trapped. It was him, the power he held, the way his presence seemed to seep into everything she did. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what he had said. Her life had always been a series of survival tactics, keeping her head down, staying unnoticed. But now, in this place, she was being forced into the spotlight. Every move she made seemed to draw attention, not just from the Duke, but from the shadows of the mansion itself. As she walked through the halls, she felt eyes on her, even when no one was there. The grandeur of Grey Court seemed to swallow her, making her feel small and insignificant. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the pull that kept her there. There was something in this place that she couldn't escape, something that kept drawing her back, even though she knew it would change her in ways she couldn't yet understand. The Duke had made it clear that there was no going back. Emily sat alone in the library that evening, the weight of her thoughts pressing heavily on her. She tried to focus on the books around her, the comforting smell of old pages, but her mind kept drifting back to the Duke. What did he mean by his cryptic words? Was he warning her, or was he testing her? She wasn't sure, but she couldn't deny the sense of danger that lingered in the air whenever he was near. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond her reach. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, growing closer. She turned, her heart racing, as the Duke appeared in the doorway. His gaze locked with hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You're still here," he said quietly, his voice filled with an unreadable emotion. "I thought you might have left by now." Emily stood, unsure of how to respond. She had come here with no expectations, but now she found herself caught in the web of this man's world, unable to untangle herself. "I'm not sure I can leave," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The Duke's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, you can't," he agreed, stepping further into the room. He paused in front of her, his presence commanding, yet strangely magnetic. "You belong here now, Miss Carson." His words sent a shiver down her spine. There was something final in the way he said it, as if this was no longer a choice. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to ask him why, wanted to know what was happening between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded. The Duke's eyes softened for just a moment, but then he turned away, his gaze shifting toward the fireplace. "There's much you don't understand," he said, his tone quieter now, almost as if speaking to himself. "But you will. In time." Emily stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling both more lost and more intrigued than ever. She had no idea where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. Emily stood in the dim light of the library, her mind spinning from the Duke's cryptic words. "You belong here now," he had said. The finality in his voice sent a ripple of uncertainty through her. What did that mean? Was she truly a part of this world now, a part of his world? The walls of Grey Court, once intimidating and cold, now seemed to close in on her. She was no longer the outsider. At least, that's what the Duke seemed to believe. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her, something he was keeping hidden. Days passed in a blur of silence and small exchanges. The Duke would occasionally summon her, and they would share brief, almost formal conversations over meals. But there was always an underlying tension, something unspoken that neither of them dared to address. She caught glimpses of the man he truly was, shadows of vulnerability and cracks in the armor he so carefully maintained. But each time, those moments were fleeting, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Emily tried to focus on her daily routines, to keep her mind occupied, but it wasn't enough. The questions kept swirling in her head. Why had the Duke brought her here? Why had he chosen her out of everyone? She wasn't special. She was just a poor orphan, a girl with no family, no future. But here, in Grey Court, it felt as if she was someone of importance, someone worth protecting. It was a strange feeling, one that both comforted and frightened her. Late one evening, as the wind howled outside, Emily found herself wandering the halls of the mansion once again. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant crackling of the fire in the hearth. She had never been this restless before, but tonight, something felt different. She wasn't sure what she was searching for, but she couldn't stay still. The corridors seemed endless, winding through the mansion like a maze. She passed through the grand ballroom, now empty and silent, its polished floors reflecting the dim light from the candles. As she moved deeper into the mansion, she felt the weight of the Duke's words pressing down on her. "You belong here now." It wasn't just a statement. It was a command, a challenge. Emily stopped in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling through the gap. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. She wasn't supposed to be snooping around. She wasn't supposed to be here, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, cozy even, filled with books and papers scattered across a large wooden desk. It was nothing like the grand chamber she had seen before. This room felt personal, almost intimate. Emily's eyes scanned the room, landing on a portrait hanging on the far wall. It was a painting of the Duke, younger, his face softer, his eyes less guarded. He looked so different, vulnerable even. The brushstrokes captured a moment of stillness, a time before the weight of responsibility had hardened him. Emily's fingers brushed over the edge of the frame, and for a moment, she wondered what had happened to him, what had shaped him into the man he was now. She didn't know why, but she felt a sudden surge of empathy. She could never imagine what it would be like to live with so much power, so much expectation. But there was something in that painting that made her think that, once, he had been just like her, young, full of hope, maybe even searching for something. "Miss Carson," a voice broke through her thoughts. She turned, her heart racing. The Duke stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on hers. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, just quiet, steady gaze. "I see you found my private study." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had been caught, but he didn't seem upset. Instead, there was a hint of something else, perhaps curiosity, or something softer. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly, stepping away from the painting. "I was just curious." The Duke finished for her, his tone not unkind. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, Miss Carson," he added, his gaze intense. "But I suppose it's only natural." Emily swallowed, unsure of how to respond. The silence between them was thick, charged. The Duke took a step toward her, his presence filling the room. "You're right to be curious," he said softly. "But there are things you don't yet understand. And some things, perhaps, you're better off not knowing." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket of uncertainty. She didn't know what to make of it. All she knew was that she had stepped into something far bigger than herself, and there was no turning back now. The Duke's words lingered in Emily's mind long after he had left her standing in his study. "Some things, perhaps, you're better off not knowing." The words echoed through her thoughts like a warning, a threat almost, though he had said them with a calmness that only deepened the unease creeping through her. She had never imagined that something so simple as curiosity could lead her down this winding, uncertain path. But now that she had crossed a threshold, there was no turning back. The mansion felt even colder that night. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was still, too still, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer with every tick of the clock. She had tried to understand the Duke, to make sense of the enigma he had become, but each moment left her more confused than the last. His gaze had softened for just a moment, but the weight of his presence never left her. She felt it everywhere she went, his power, his control, his unspoken expectations. And yet, there was something else there too. A crack in his armor, a vulnerability she couldn't quite put her finger on. What was it about her that made him so drawn to her? Why had he brought her here? She didn't belong in this world. She had never belonged in a place like this. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She sat up, startled. She hadn't expected anyone at this hour. She walked to the door and opened it to find a servant standing there, holding a letter. "The Duke requests your presence, Miss Carson," the servant said, his voice polite but impersonal. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was late. Why would the Duke want to see her now? She nodded, trying to hide the unease she felt. "Thank you," she said, taking the letter from him. The servant bowed and left without another word. Emily closed the door behind her and tore open the envelope. Inside was a simple note, written in the Duke's unmistakable script. "Meet me in the garden at midnight." Emily's mind raced. Why the garden? And why now? The silence of the mansion was oppressive, and she felt a deep unease settle over her. But she couldn't ignore the summons. She had to go. She dressed quickly, donning her warmest coat, and slipped quietly through the halls. The storm had finally subsided, leaving the night air crisp and cold. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the path leading to the garden. As Emily stepped outside, the cool air hit her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. She pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked toward the garden, her footsteps muffled by the soft ground. The Duke was already there, standing by the fountain, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. As she approached, he turned to face her, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "You came," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying tension. Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. "I had to," she replied softly. "Why the garden, Your Grace?" The Duke's gaze never wavered. "This place is where things begin," he said quietly. "Where they end." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The words felt loaded with meaning, but she couldn't quite grasp what he was trying to tell her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "The world you knew is gone," he said, his tone final. "Everything changes now." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had walked into. The Duke wasn't just offering her a place in his world. He was drawing her into something much darker, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The Duke's gaze softened for just a moment, and he took a step back, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, his voice low, "we begin." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She wasn't sure what that meant, but she knew one thing. Her life was no longer her own. She was trapped in this world now, and there was no escaping it. Emily stood there, in the garden, the Duke's words still echoing in her mind. "We begin." What did that mean? Her heart raced, a mixture of fear and anticipation gripping her. The garden, bathed in moonlight, seemed to stretch forever, its shadows playing tricks on her eyes. She had come here seeking answers, but now she found herself more lost than ever. The Duke's presence was overwhelming, like a storm that threatened to consume everything in its path. She tried to steady her breath, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The Duke turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the garden. "This is where it all starts, Miss Carson," he said, his voice low and filled with something that she couldn't quite place. "But don't mistake the calm for peace. In places like this, change is inevitable." Emily felt the weight of his words press down on her. She had been living in survival mode for so long that the idea of change felt foreign. But now, standing here in the Duke's world, it seemed impossible to escape. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. The idea of belonging to something, anything, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What kind of change?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the fragile silence between them. The Duke turned back to her, his eyes cold and calculating. "The kind that forces you to confront who you really are." He took a step closer, his presence closing in around her. "And that, Miss Carson, is the most dangerous part of it all. You may think you know yourself, but you don't. Not yet." Emily's heart raced faster, her mind spinning with his words. Who was she in this world? A mere pawn in the Duke's game? Or was there more to her than she realized? "I'm not afraid of what I'll find," she said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm not so sure about that," he replied quietly. "But you will be soon enough." The chill in his voice sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to back down. She had already come this far, and there was no turning back now. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to creep in. The Duke's lips curled into a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I want you to accept that there is no going back, he said softly. You are a part of something now, Miss Carson. You belong to this world, whether you want to or not. Emily felt a rush of emotions, fear, anger, confusion, all blending together. She had always been in control of her own life, always managed to escape the things that tried to hold her down. But now, standing before the Duke, she felt a sense of helplessness she couldn't ignore. What do you expect from me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I expect you to learn, he said quietly. I expect you to understand that the only way to survive here is to accept that you are no longer in control. His words struck her like a blow. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what that meant, but she knew one thing. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The Duke turned away from her, walking back toward the center of the garden, leaving Emily standing in the moonlight, her mind racing with the weight of his words. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. She was trapped in his world now, and there was no escaping it. The following days felt like a blur to Emily, a mixture of anticipation and confusion. Each moment with the Duke left her more entangled in a web of uncertainty, yet there was a strange comfort in the tension that pulsed between them. His words, his presence, both suffocating and magnetic, seemed to draw her closer to a world she didn't understand, but couldn't escape. She wandered the halls of Grey Court more often now, her steps growing more familiar with the vast estate. The mansion felt less foreign, yet still impossible to grasp. The walls, the rooms, all of them held secrets she couldn't unlock, but they were also becoming a part of her reality. And with each passing day, the Duke's influence over her grew stronger. He was everywhere, and nowhere all at once. He was in the quiet moments when she was left alone, in the silence of the library, and in the soft rustle of the curtains as the wind moved through the windows. And he was always in the back of her mind, his eyes following her, even when he wasn't there. It was at dinner one evening, under the dim glow of the chandelier, that the tension finally broke. The Duke sat across from her, his usual cool demeanor unchanged, but there was something different in the way he looked at her tonight. His eyes lingered a little longer, as if searching for something, or perhaps testing her. Emily met his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. She had come to expect his silent scrutiny, but tonight it felt heavier, more intense. You've been quiet tonight, Miss Carson, the Duke said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that sent a shiver through her. Is something on your mind? She could feel the weight of his gaze, his words pulling at the edge of her resolve. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about his cryptic warnings, his insistence that she wasn't in control, and she was beginning to wonder if she would ever feel free again. I've been thinking, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. About what you said, about change, about being trapped. The Duke's expression shifted, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Ah yes, I see you've been paying attention, he said softly, his voice low, almost too calm. The changes will come whether you're ready or not. But the question is, Miss Carson, will you accept them when they do? Emily felt her heart race as she considered his words. Could she accept this world, this life? Was she ready to let go of everything she had known? Or was she just a pawn in a game much bigger than she had imagined? She couldn't answer him right away. The truth was, she didn't know. Everything had changed since she had stepped foot in Grey Court. Her past seemed so distant now, and yet she couldn't escape the pull of the Duke's world. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to think anymore. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curling up slightly. Perhaps that's the problem, he said quietly. You think too much, Miss Carson. His words struck her, not like an insult, but like a challenge. She felt a strange mix of anger and something else, something she couldn't name. And what am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice sharper now, as the frustration bubbled to the surface. The Duke's smile widened just a fraction. You stop thinking and start living, he said simply. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily's breath caught in her chest. He was right. In all the uncertainty, in all the fear she had felt, she had forgotten to live. The Duke was offering her a life, one that was far from what she had imagined. But was she ready to accept it? Was she ready to give up the life she had known for something that felt so much bigger than her? The silence between them stretched, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like an opening, a crack in the wall that had been built around her heart. She wasn't sure if she was ready to walk through it, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep hiding in the shadows forever.